My experiment focused on voluntary discomfort and discipline. The goal was to remove small comforts and unnecessary distractions to see what I relied on and whether they were holding me back. I wanted to test whether meaning could come from persistence and effort rather than convenience and comfort. For almost 4 weeks, I followed several rules. First, I eliminated sweets and sugary drinks. I only drank water, and I avoided things like candy, soda, and chocolate. The idea was to remove unnecessary pleasures and see how much I relied on them out of habit. Second, I took cold showers every day. Cold showers are physically uncomfortable, but they force you to be fully present in the moment, instead of relaxing and zoning out like most people do in warm shower. Another part of the experiment was underdressing slightly for the weather. Nothing unsafe, but just enough to make things a little uncomfortable. Like the cold showers, it forced me to focus on what I was doing instead of worrying about other things like exams or practice as I walked to class every day. I also used the sauna, which is something I did occasionally already, but I wanted to increase it to a daily habit because it requires sitting still in an uncomfortable environment for a long period of time, which became another form of voluntary struggle. This became my time to pray every single day and focus on how everything went with practice and class and what I could have done better. The final challenge was limiting my screen time to around 3 hours a day. The purpose was to spend more time focusing on school, relationships, work, and track, rather than staring at my phone. To track the experiment, I wrote a short journal entry every night describing how the day went and whether it felt meaningful. The experiment was influenced by Camus and his idea of absurdity. Camus argued that humans naturally search for meaning, but the universe does not provide clear answers. This conflict between our desire for meaning and the indifference of the world creates what he calls the absurd. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus uses the story of Sisyphus who is forced to push a rock up a hill forever, and if he reaches the top he will earn his freedom. Yet it is an impossible task, as each time he got close the rock rolled back down the hill. At first, this seems like a meaningless task. However, Camus argues that meaning can come from persistence in continuing the struggle anyways. My experiment tried to imitate this idea a little bit by voluntarily doing uncomfortable things each day. I created a repeated struggle that I chose myself. The goal to see whether I could find meaning from persistence and discipline, even when the activities themselves were uncomfortable or repetitive. The first week went well. I followed the rules as closely as I could, but the habits weren't automatic yet. I had to remind myself each day or else I would forget. The cold showers were not that fun. I had to start warm and move it down to cold. And by the end of the week, I was starting to get the entire thing down. I was able to focus more on schoolwork and was more present outside of practice and class. And I was able to keep my screen time down to just under 3.5 hours a day. The second week was a little bit more difficult. The novelty of the experiment was starting to wear off, and real life started to interfere. The weather got really cold, and it made the underdressing rule harder to follow. I also had a track meet, so I skipped the sauna and cold showers as I didn't want those to affect my performance. But even though I didn't follow every rule perfectly, the week showed me how strong some of my habits are and how easy it was to fall back into them. My screen time also went up a little week, but I was recording and watching videos, so I was on my phone for 8 hours both days at the meet, so that made it increase quite a bit. And still, it just showed that it was harder to stay consistent and limit my distractions when things get busy. When I get done with a busy day, I just want to sit and watch reels, but that's a bad habit. And I was focused on stopping that during the week. Third week, it started to feel more like a normal routine. The sauna was easier and easier, and cold showers still weren't fun, but after the sauna, they felt nice. I started to notice how often I would pick up my phone without thinking, which made me realize how much of a habit that actually is. And some days felt boring because I wasn't filling my time with my phone, but I got a lot more homework done. I didn't procrastinate at all. I was much more productive. I kept catching myself before going over my screen time goal, and even though my average ended up around 4.5, it was more difficult this week because I couldn't distract myself with practice, and I only had a limited amount of homework. Last week was probably the most physically difficult because it overlapped with intense practices and lifting sessions, and I was extremely sore and even threw up. So the sauna was much harder as well. And after practice, I was already hot and exhausted, so I was not looking forward to it. But I still went. And even though I wasn't perfect, by this point, the experiment was less about following everything exactly and more about how I handled it rather than just skipping it just because it was inconvenient. And by the end, most of the habits felt normal, and I was much more aware of how often I rely on the distractions and just the small routines of just being lazy throughout the day. Most days I won, even though I didn't do everything perfectly, because I still attempted to do them. Key insights I learned were voluntary discomfort can create meaning through choice and effort. Even failure or disruption is valuable if it teaches you something about self discipline, and limiting distractions improve focus, productivity, and presence. And finally, repetition and persistence in mundane or difficult tasks form the foundation of meaningful action. Takeaway was learning isn't about being perfect, it's about choosing to engage and attempting to persist through discomfort, even when it gets difficult. I plan to continue some of the habits that I thought were the most valuable, like limiting screen time, going to the sauna, focusing on school, work, and track instead of my phone, and limiting the snacks and unhealthy food and drinks. This experiment really brought the idea of suffering to life for me. I had been aware of it, but never truly thought of it until I was journaling every day and really focused on the suffering. Discussions at FCA and a lot of the Bible verses I had read since I started the experiment were about suffering as Christ did on the cross and resisting temptation and following the right path even when it gets difficult. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And that helped me get through it as well.